morning again. Hey, I gave you all time to get ready for a Wednesday morning good morning, not a Monday morning good morning. Good morning. Okay, good, because we got some important work to do here today. I am so excited. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Carol Mason, and I'm the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. But Rosanna's really my boss now. You laugh. She's on my foundation board, so she is. So we're pleased to have you here for this conversation. I think it's a first of its kind, Mike? Ramp up, yeah? So we're going to be studying, talking about and studying. It's a very timely conversation around Latinx communities in the criminal legal system. And you know, there's this great debate about whether we use the word criminal legal system or criminal justice system. I think in this context, it's appropriate to talk about criminal legal system because we're also talking about immigration policy. But I just want you to know from my standpoint, when we're talking particularly about the justice system, I prefer to call it the criminal justice system because it's still aspirational. I have not given up hope that our justice system can one day be just. But this meeting we're having today shows the intersection and complexity of a lot of issues impacting our legal system here in the U.S., particularly as it relates to Latinx population communities. So at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, we educated talented and brilliant students, many of whom I hope you've had an opportunity to engage with and hire. Notice that. Working to be the next generation of policymakers, executive leaders, and public servants in the field of criminal justice. John Jay College is an Hispanic-serving institution with a rich, very culturally rich and diverse population. And so it's a lower threshold to be considered an Hispanic-serving institution, but half of our students are now of Latinx origin. And so we are truly an Hispanic-serving institution, and I use the word serving because what we ought to be doing is making sure that we are serving the Latinx community, and that's part of what this program is about today. And because of one of the things that we're here to do as John Jay and leaders in this kind of work. We are discussing racial disparities within the criminal legal system with a specific focus on Latinx communities. Today we will highlight the unique and disparate treatment faced by Latinx people and their surrounding communities, including the immigration system involvement, language barriers, and other unseen consequences, and some seen. Racial disparities continue to be a fixture of our criminal legal system, and Latinx people are the fastest growing minority group within the U.S. At some point, we're going to stop saying minority group because you're going to be the majority. And so again, we have to think about our language and think about, that's one of the complexities of what is challenging our country today is the changing demographics and what we used to think of, or still some think of, as who's the majority population. Maybe one day we can get away from those terms at all and not talk about who's majority, who's minority, and just talk about who's part of our communities and how are we making sure we're serving everybody equitably and fairly. So the growing population and growing representation of our Latinx community has coincided with decades of punitive criminal justice measures such as the war on drugs, and that's what it was. It was a war. We hope now they change that language and think about it in terms of what it really is. I know this is being recorded, and I sometimes go, well, I've been off script the whole time today. You know, it was a war on drugs until it became other people who were involved with the drugs, and now we think of it as a public health issue, which it really is and should always have been considered. So we want to get away from the war language, the war mentality, and get into the language of thinking about how we're supporting the success of all communities. And today we're focused again on the Latinx community and the intersection between the criminalization of immigration and mass incarceration. Again, we are using wrong tools to deal with the challenges our country is facing and doesn't know how to address. And too often our default is to criminalize things that have no business being criminalized. And one thing that I hope we all agree on here is there's a word that I hate, and I just got back from an overseas trip, and last night, literally. You all are my first work thing today. But this is so important. And the language around calling people illegal, people can't be illegal. It just can't be. And so I'm hoping that as policymakers, activists, and everyone in this room, that we do our part to make sure we're changing not just the language, but also people's understanding of the complexities and thinking about how are we addressing, again, creating thriving communities for everyone. And so there is a lot of evidence about these things, but not enough data, as Mike Rempel and and where's Crystal? There you go. Are going to talk about later about how do we have the right, accurate, and better data to be able to track what's happening, because you can't address things if you don't really know what's happening. And so that's going to be part of the discussion today. And how do we use data to rectify the deficiencies and inequalities in our systems. And so we're going to be honored today to be joined by many esteemed panelists, including, so I don't know everyone, so and I want to see who you are. When I call your name, can you just give me a nod so I know who you are? Juan Cartagena, thank you. Former president and general counsel at Latino Justice. So do you call it PRLDF? Okay, I thought that was Pearl Def, but I didn't want, because I date myself, just like I still call the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I call it the Inc. Fund, and somebody asked me once, how old are you? And when I told them 67, they said, oh, that's why you called it Inc. Fund. Names change, and so that's why I want to make sure I say the right thing and not my antiquated phrasing. Anna Bermudez is, there you go, I see you, nice to see you. She's the former New York City Commissioner of Probation, and later today we'll hear from the Honorable Catalina Cruz, who is in the New York State Assembly and an alum of John Jay, and an alum of CUNY Law School. And we will then also hear from the Honorable Carmen de la Rosa of the New York City Council. The event was organized jointly today by the Data Collaborators for Justice, I've already mentioned Crystal and Mike, and John Jay's Institute for Justice and Opportunity. There's Andre, he keeps moving around, Andre Ward. Please recognize him. And the Manhattan Neighborhood Network El Barrio Firehouse Community Media Center and the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, affectionately called TCJS, that's a mouthful, for their support for this event. So now I get the pleasure of introducing the woman who is really focused on these issues and is committed to making a difference in New York State, and she already is. And when I called her my boss, I wasn't joking. She's all of our boss, because how many of you have had a call from Rosanna about what you should be doing? You know everybody's hand ought to be going up in this room, unless you are very new to this work. And if you haven't had one, you will have one. But she does her homework, and she knows the data, and she does her research. And so when she calls you and says we need to do X, she's done the work behind it. You really ought to listen to her and do X. X plus, actually. And she has high aspirations for all of us. And high aspirations for what we can and will do. And so I want everybody to understand that today that this is the beginning of, it's not the beginning, continuation of making sure that we ensure that this work gets done. So who is Rosanna? So she is, again, the head of the Division of Criminal Justice Services. She was also the former Secretary of State, and she coined a phrase that I love and use all the time. She said that John Jay is like the UN of justice issues, that we can bring everybody together to have difficult conversations, and that's what we're going to do today, is not just have difficult, honest conversation today about the changes we're going to make. So not only is she a powerful leader, but she's also an alum of John Jay. There's a theme, yes. And she's been a professor here, and I learn from her every day, so I look forward to you all learning from Rosanna and being inspired by Rosanna, and leaving with the belief of we're going to do this. We're going to make these changes happen. We're going to change the world because she's got the vision, and we're going to execute on that vision. So thank you in joining me, welcoming Rosanna Rosado to the stage.
So I watched my cousin, Andy, who's actually here today, walk out of the gate of a Florida prison after 17 years, and that was 17 years ago. I was watching him from the car where I had sat for 5 hours waiting for his release. He was walking slowly around a cement path until an officer who knew that I had been there all day gave him permission to step on the grass and to take that shortcut across to where I was. So he had gone to prison at 19, and although he came out of a dark place, he was hopeful and he was ready to embrace freedom. He was eager for that second chance that we talk about, and neither of us had a clue of how that was going to happen. But I had a CEO job in New York City. I was CEO and publisher of El Diario, and I was kind of full of myself. And I had many friends in high places in New York, so I was quite confident. And it took me 6 months to bring him to New York. And it's really ironic because today my agency actually does the Interstate Complex, which is about bringing people into. But I didn't have that, kind of pull then. There are so many stories to describe the journey of those early years. I'm writing a book about it. But when he moved out of my home to his own place after 2 years, I was exhausted. And I was a little scarred. And I thought, how do regular people do this? Right? Because I didn't consider myself regular, and I told you I had all this access. And I had money, But I thought, who helps people through this? Where do they get help if they need help? Where do they get the answers, right? In many ways, the individual who's being released is being helped, by the system, but the families, who do they go to? So trained as a journalist, I interviewed everybody. I went out trying to find the answers, and one day I was sitting with Julio Medina at Exodus, and I said, I don't know how to start these conversations because I want to be authentic, but I don't have lived experience. I'm kind of a goody two-shoes. So, and he said, but you do, you live the experience of the families of incarcerated individuals. And so I went looking for information on the families and who was helping them, and I couldn't find information. So many of you here today, joining us by live stream and here in person, are involved in the work of fighting injustice every day. And I want to thank you for all that you do. I know that it takes a lot of energy, and it takes faith and hope, because it involves challenging the task of changing minds. When Carol mentions, the term illegal, I don't know, 10 times a month. I'm like, yeah, people are not illegal. This is what you should call them, or changing vocabulary. But you have chosen to be here today, and I appreciate it, because today is important. It's about thinking and planning, and it's about the future. For me, I'm sorry, we all come to this work through different paths, and for me it was reentry. Reentry is the issue that brought me to government. Like, left my CEO job and came to John Jay for 3 years of teaching, which was kind of very humbling to be in a class full of students who can all be your kids. But that's another speech. But watching the process of a loved one reentering society ignited my passion and my desire to help. I see reentry as a rebirth. And for those of you who have been present at a birth, it's messy, but it's beautiful, right? So supporting my cousin throughout this crucial period of his life brought me into the lived experience of so many Latinx families. And this is why the Latinx question is so important. This is why today's conversation is crucial and deserving of our attention, because our families have been affected by the intentional incarceration of 3 generations of mostly Black and brown men. There's empirical data to prove this. We as a society also did this, right? We endorsed this. We even supported harsh laws and harsh sentences because we thought that was the solution. The impact on our neighborhoods was severe. The way in which our abuelas were made to feel that there was something wrong with our youth. Addiction was criminalized, was a stigma. Compassion was not visible. Shame hardened the community and allowed them to support these harsh laws. And we know today that they were harsh because our response to the opioid crisis has been so humane. And there are many studies comparing it to the crack epidemic, and there are studies that, kind of prove that, right? In his 2001 memoir, A Place to Stand, Jimmy Santiago Baca wrote about the childhood trauma and adult decisions, and he described broken families. He didn't have any of that vocabulary, but he taught himself to write in prison, which is where he ended up after his grandmother dropped him and his siblings off at an orphanage in Albuquerque. It was in that book that I first understood the impact of childhood events. That was an important lesson for me as a parent, but I also thought about my cousin and how in a family of, we have 80 cousins. My grandmother had 14 children. So in a family where we raised a bunch of kids who weren't even related to us, right? We call them hermanos de crianza. Somehow we have failed him. How did he fall to the cracks and wind up in prison? I interviewed my family as well, and everyone had a different version of the story. You know, the themes were the themes you know, right? Divorce, minding your business, my crazy uncle, family drama. When I visited him in Florida prisons, I saw so many young Latino men, and I wanted answers about Latino families. I wanted to know why and how they had ended up here. Because I had all these single friends in New York, and I'm like, this is where all the guys are, you know, divided communities. So I went looking for answers. I did my research. You know, I was a journalist, so I did my research, but I could not find the information. I could not find the data, the books, the monographs, nada. There is one complete and important report done by what was then National Council of La Raza, now it's Unidos, in 2004, right, 20 years ago. The report was entitled Lost Opportunities, the Reality of Latinos in the U.S. Criminal Justice System. And here's a quote: Latinos are virtually invisible in the majority of key studies and publications in the field, and a number of states and federal agencies neither collect nor publish Latino criminal justice data. Thus, until recently, Hispanics were rarely included in policy debates in the criminal justice field. This situation has not changed dramatically since 2004, although I am happy and a bit smug to report that in New York State, we do collect some data, and you can find it on the DCJS website at criminal.justice or criminaljustice.ny.gov. And you click on statistics, and you're going to hear from Lee later today, who runs that shop. So in New York State, this data is from 2022. Latinos represented in 2022 18% of the population and 25% of adult arrests and 20% of prison sentences. So not that different, right, from what the report cites. I'm proud to say that at DCJS we have many different data sets available online that show justice system metrics by race and ethnicity. We are committed to using data and evidence to inform our work, and we share this information online so the public and policymakers can do the same. The availability and scope of this information would not be possible without the dedicated staff of the DCJS Office of Research and Performance, and I want to acknowledge Deputy Commissioner Lee Bates for her leadership in that office. I don't see her because I don't have my glasses on. She's all the way in the back, but you're going to hear from her later. The challenge is when you have that information today, but you have no information from yesterday. You can't do the variances, right? When I was at Department of State, one day I said, you know, we need this information, and somebody was a Latino who worked there said, why do you want that information? We don't need to document, you know, people who went to prison. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, we need to know the truth, right, so that we can move forward. So invisibility has consequences, right? On the first day of my LLS class here at John Jay, I gave a quiz. It was Jose Luis Morin's quiz, and the first true or false question was, quote, immigrants commit the most crimes in the US. And this was in the fall of 2014, in a class that was 61% Latino students. The majority answered true. It takes a whole semester with me to undo that. And that is one impact of invisibility, that our young people believe the narratives about us. The criminalization of immigration in a country of so many immigrants is another travesty that our community has suffered in a disproportionate way. And I'm glad we are addressing that issue today. In 2010, a legal scholar who was married to a prosecutor and was a mom wrote with such impeccable precision about the impact of mass incarceration that she woke us up from a reverie by calling it the new Jim Crow. Michelle Alexander forcibly removed the blindfold from our eyes, at least from my eyes, for sure. And part of the gift that Alexander gave to us was a little mention in the introduction. She said, I'm writing this book because I have 3 black boys at home, but somebody should do this for Latinos. And that was in 2010. That made such an impact on me that I went looking for who could be our Michelle Alexander. I wanted to write the book, but you know, I'm not a legal scholar. And I was intimidated, so I went to Juan Cartagena. and he did 2 things. I mean, this was not a new issue to him, right? Juan had a whole history of his work at CSS, and he was now at Latino Justice. And he did two things. He wrote the intro to the Alexander book in Spanish called El Color de la Justicia. And then he carved out a space at Latino Justice to delve into this work on a national level. But like many nonprofits and the organizations that you all work for and the government agents that we all work for, we are led by the tyranny of the urgent, which is the day-to-day work of helping people put themselves back together like Humpty Dumpty. We don't have time to look up or to come out from under the hood and document stories and do research and fill this gap of data and narratives. But today, it is crucial that we make the time and fill that gap. Partially because I'm at DCJS. As I tell my staff, we have a minute in the movie, we don't know how long that movie is, so let's get this stuff done. Against the backdrop of a country that has lost its way, right? Perhaps its very moral compass, we have forgotten our core value, which, in my view, should be humanity and dignity, above all else. Watching the plethora of political ads this season, I am struck by the term migrant crisis. Most Americans don't know the difference between a migrant, an immigrant, an asylum seeker, or a dreamer, right? In my view, this is a crisis of values, but I digress. We'll leave that, we'll table that for another day. Today's agenda is perfect, and I am grateful to Crystal Rodriguez, Policy Director of DCJ, and Andre Ward, Director of the Institute for Justice and Opportunity, for creating this space and for letting me crash it. Because the truth is, they called me, they said, can you come? I said, that date doesn't work for me. And they said, sorry. And I was like, no, you got to change the date so I can be there because this is very important to me. And they did. So I know when she said that, I call people and tell them what to do. I think it's true. I want to thank Carol Mason as well. As she knows, this is one of my happy places. I'm campaigning, Carol, to have an office here so I can hold just these random office hours on a monthly basis. I really miss being around the students, but it has to be in the new building. I don't want to be at BMW. My amazing DCJS people are here today also, and I want to thank them for their support of all my projects. The agency's current budget is the largest in the history, a record $500 million increase secured by Governor Kathy Hochul. I don't know if she knew what we were going to do with it, but we've done really great work. That money has allowed DCJS to provide the resources to all our partners in law enforcement, community corrections, alternatives to incarceration, reentry, and obviously it's allowed us to make an investment into the local communities to help to fund their ability to be resilient and to also help tell us what the solutions are, right? And the importance of the resources is, you know, I always think of like the Puerto Rican grandma who says, yo no me meto en tu vida. I don't get involved in your life, but now that I'm giving you $20, I'm going to tell you what to do with it. And so I think that's a very powerful thing, to be at the table. When we go out to these communities, we don't say we're going to go back to Albany and find the money. We say we have the money. So here's, you know, what are the solutions? And that has been working, especially in historically underserved neighborhoods. We have so much talent in the room, and it's time to pool the resources and focus on our people so that we can begin the work of repair, right? Ya es tiempo. I want to end by sharing a story about one of my students from Sing Sing, John Adrian Velasquez, who was exonerated 4 weeks ago. So in the early years of his incarceration, when he was in despair, as you can imagine it is to be in prison for a crime you didn't commit, his mom said to him, focus on your future. You just have to grow where you are planted. And I just think that's so powerful, to grow where you are planted. Wherever you are in life, wherever you are today, you can grow from that moment, right? We're not always where we think we should be or where we want to be, but we can always grow where we are planted. Inspired by her words, he battled for his freedom as he earned a BA and a master's, and the years went by, and he reminded himself each day that this was a temporary situation. He was relentless. I am so happy for him. But every day for the last 4 weeks, I cannot stop thinking about his mom. One, for the amazing words she used to shake him out of that despair. Grow where you are planted. And two, For the hope and the faith it takes to wait 30 years to declare that your son was not who they said he was. I think of the anguish of all of our moms, but especially those whose sons and daughters were removed from society without a real shot at justice. Y eso me hace sufrir. The damage done to families and the many children impacted by parents' absence. But I never lose hope. I want to change the conversation from punishment to healing, and this is an urgent matter for me, and I hope today it will become one for you. No more lost opportunities or lost generations. We can change that course now. We can do this on the strength of our knowledge, our commitment, our collective desire to change the narrative, and I believe we owe that. We owe that to our grandparents, we owe that to our ancestors. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I'm Krista Rodriguez, Policy Director at the Data Collaborative for Justice, and I'm so excited to be here with all of you who are in the room and with all of you who are joining us online, and particularly with our amazing panelists. I'm going to ask for our panelists on panel one if you can begin to join me. I'm so grateful for the time that we're taking to have this conversation and for partnerships like Commissioner Rosado and DCJS and the assistance that they've given us in bringing this program together, and for so many of you taking the time to be here with us. So I'm honored again to be here with so many incredible people and panelists and folks who have really dedicated their life efforts to addressing justice within the criminal justice system, but also looking at racial disparities in particular. I'm going to give a brief introduction. We have individuals with long, storied careers, and we've supplied their bios online. So if you take a look at our event webpage, you'll be able to find more information about each speaker today. One more housekeeping thing before we delve into the program. We've supplied note cards. There's note cards on every seat. There's a pen maybe every other seat. We're going to be taking questions as time permits, and so we're going to ask for folks that as questions come up, you write them down if you're in the room. We're also going to try to honor the folks asking questions online as well, so you can use the Q&A function on the Zoom for that. And we'll have a few folks from DCJ staff and IJO staff helping to collect those cards. So you'll see them starting to sort of signal to you all that they're prepared to start taking cards. Okay, so let's delve in. First, I'm first going to introduce Juan Cartagena because I'm going to give you the first question. So as I think was already introduced earlier today, Juan Cartagena is the former president and general counsel over at Latino Justice, Pearl Def, and we are so proud and excited about the work that Latino Justice has done in years to focus on criminal justice inequities and injustices. We're also joined by Ana Bermudez, who is the former commissioner of the Department of Probation here in New York City. Currently still working on a working group to address these concerns for the city of New York. We're also joined by, immediately to my left, is Mike Rempel, who is the director at the Data Collaborative for Justice. We also have Lee Bates at the end there, who is the Deputy Commissioner over at the Division of Criminal Justice Services for the Office of Justice Research and Performance. So to start this conversation, and I'm going to direct a question to you, Juan. Could you give us, to sort of ground the conversations of today, could you give us an overview of historical trends regarding Latinos or Latinx people within the criminal justice system? And what are some of the predominant ways Latinos specifically have been impacted?
So thank you very much.
Yeah, we just have to really talk into it.
There you go. I want to tell you a little bit about how I got into this movement, and then quickly try to summarize centuries of history in a couple of minutes. As you can tell by now, I'm a Puerto Rican man. I grew up in urban America. I've been picked up by the police. So my first engagement with the criminal legal system has been being picked up by the police, by sometimes with no justification whatsoever, and sometimes with justification. I just escaped prosecution. Then when I got my law degree, I had the privilege and opportunities to be on every side of a criminal adjudication, except as a prosecutor. So I've been a criminal defense attorney. I've been a defendant. I've been a judge. I've just never been a prosecutor. And what has always drawn me to the issue of criminal justice in general has been that aspiration that if you put in the right kind of resources, people who are not guilty will not be subject to a guilty conviction. My hero when I was growing up was Perry Mason, and that dude won every week. In a half hour, too. So when I had a chance to finally put two sides of my practice and my career, civil rights work and constitutional law, with the aftermath and the consequences of the criminal legal system, and I had the opportunity to do so by heading up a national organization, of course I jumped on it. It became pretty clear that the manifestations of the criminal legal system on our gente were not being talked about at the national level in ways that made sense, in ways that would capture the reality of who we were within the system. So if you're asking what are the historical trends and what are the impacts of a criminal legal system on people that call themselves Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispano, Hispana, Mexicano, Puerto Riqueño, Salvador, all the national origins that make up the incredible richness of our presence in this country, it's pretty clear that it all starts with making sure that we talk about this issue beyond the black-white binary. The National Academy of Sciences, one of the most leading academic collections, wrote an incredibly, very powerful tome on the prison system in the United States. National Research Council, excuse me. And they wrote, and they said they're going to focus only on black, African-American experiences and white experiences within the criminal legal system for this major, major publication, which, by the way, I cite all the time. And I believe the former president of John Jay was an author, co-author. And they mentioned that 3 explanations for why they were basing their conclusions on the whole study on prison systems in the United States, exclusively on black and white disparities, because 1, the disparities are more acute for African Americans, and the history of slavery and Jim Crow lends more prominence to those disparities. 2, there's extensive literature on African American disparities. So those 3 issues. The disparities are more acute, the history of slavery and Jim Crow lends more prominence to those disparities, and 3, there's extensive literature on African Americans in the field. All those justifications are understandable, but they perpetuate the impression that Latinos in the US were never subjected to state violence or never subject to state-nurtured vigilantism. They perpetuate the impression that Latinos did not suffer de jure segregation in this country. They perpetuate the impression that the present-day disparities also that are foisted upon this community in the penal system are not rooted in that history. So our first order of business is making sure that systems throughout the country live up to the kind of incredible richness of data that DCJS is now embarking upon. And that whoever takes over for DCJS later on makes sure the data is still present at the richness that it needs in New York. So I'm going to just tick off a handful of things. Number 1, it makes sense to talk about the impact of the criminal legal system on Latinos and Latinas in this country because our presence was criminalized and is criminalized. It's criminalized first and foremost by immigration policies and immigration law. But it's criminalized in a way that not many of us understand, or at least we think we understand. So Section 1325 and 1326 of 8 U.S.C. basically criminalize entering the U.S. outside an official port of entry. If you enter outside an official place where you can cross that border, you commit a misdemeanor. If you enter, get convicted of misdemeanor, go back to your home country and try to enter again and get caught the second time, you commit a felony. 1325, 1326 were both passed In the late 1920s in the United States, at the same time the United States passed immigration laws that created the National Origins Quotas Act, which basically made preferences for visas for Northern Europeans and not Southern or Eastern Europeans. The same decade that had the highest enrollment of members in the Ku Klux Klan. The same decade that launched the incredibly pseudoscience of eugenics. That same decade criminalized this presence. But it doesn't criminalize all the presence outside of, not in conformity with immigration law. Because you can enter this country legally with a visa, right? And you enter this country legally with a visa, and then you overstay your visa. You have technically not committed a crime. It's a civil violation of immigration law. And we all know probably somebody who overstayed their visa. There's whole industries in New York that are funded by people who overstay their tourist visas. They serve us drinks at wonderful pubs. Yet we don't talk about them as an illegal problem or illegal immigration problem. So the whole issue about criminalizing presence is part and parcel of how we got to the point of recognizing that Latinos and Latinas have suffered disproportionately from a system that targets their presence in the United States as illegal. Once you get past that, it justifies in the minds of people who create policies and laws the forced repatriation of Mexicanos in 1929 by President Hoover. The forced repatriation of Mexicanos and citizens of the United States who are Mexican origin by Operation Wetback in the 1950s, which, if you're reading Project 2025, and if you're paying attention to what the major candidate for presidency is talking about, he wants to revive. The entire system of federal adjudication for crime is inundated with Latinos and Latinas. The far majority of prosecutions, if you walk into a federal court system by federal judges who are adjudicating criminal cases, the far majority are for Latinas and Latinos. Many of those prosecutions are premised on illegal violations of 1325, 1326. So you have this Operation Streamline, which is an outrageous affront to justice, in which people just stand up and by the scores. This would be a perfect example. This would be a federal courtroom. I'm the federal judge. I'll ask everybody on this side of the room to stand up. All 40 of you stand up. I take your plea en masse, and I find you guilty, because you just pleaded guilty to a violation of 1325. I don't want to hear about your personal situation, that you thought you could apply for asylum if you just get to the United States, for example. You have been adjudicated, and it's streamlined. And that one judge, I sat in a court in Tucson, Arizona, I could not believe what I was hearing. That one judge, all that judge did the entire day was prosecute people, find them guilty by the 20s, standing up 20, 30 at a time. Last big point. Once you start recognizing the interplay between our identity as people, as gente in this country, and recognizing how that manifests itself in what law enforcement does, and law enforcement is forced to do so by laws that were written by Congress and others, then you recognize that our presence is also criminalized because of who we look like. So things like, driving while brown. When I was a Latino justice, we had an amazing case called Eating While Brown. Roxana Orellano Santos, Frederick County, Maryland. Her only crime? She was eating lunch. They suspected her of being here illegally. She did not go to her immigration appointment after she crossed the border. But she didn't get a notice that she was supposed to appear. Didn't make a difference. The sheriffs in Frederick County arrested her because she looked Latina, and I guess that she looked illegally here as a Latina woman, just by eating lunch in public. Two last points. It is obvious that the criminal legal system and its consequences are and those consequences are real among many kind of systems. And I'm really happy that today's conversations later on are going to talk about the impacts of criminal adjudications on other systems, like family systems and civil systems. Those are critically important. But the fact of the matter is as well that since this is election time, we're still dealing with the fact that in this country, you can have a felony conviction and still not be able to vote. that you can have a felony conviction, still not be able to vote at a time in which every vote seems to matter between now and Election Day next week? That the Census Project has now estimated that about 4.1 million citizens in the United States cannot vote because of because they have a felony conviction on their record. 4.1 million. And lastly, I hope we get a chance to talk about this later in more detail, but you cannot talk about Latinidad and the criminal legal system without also talking about the war on drugs. You can't talk about the war on drugs without talking about Central America, the Caribbean, and Latin America. I'm sorry. I can't believe that we could have any kind of conversation about the war on drugs and its effects on U.S. populations without talking about what it means when a country's insatiable appetite for drugs forces corruption in the governments of Latin America and Central America and the Caribbean to feed that insatiable appetite for illicit drugs and the corruption and death that it causes among our own countries. If you're going to talk about the war on drugs and its effects and its solutions, Latinos need to be at that table, front and center. So I'll end with that because I can keep going, but I know we have a lot of other systems to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for doing an incredible job of summarizing decades of history, just so that we at least have a bit of grounding, but we could have an entire lecture, of course, delving into what has brought us to this point. I want to, something that you actually mentioned, this impact on other systems that surround the criminal legal system that we may not immediately think about, but I want to direct a question to Ana. How have this legacy, these decades of criminal justice policy, how have they impacted or crossed over into surrounding systems and agencies like child welfare services or juvenile justice systems, if you can share on that?
So I think they all share so many things that it's really a cesspool of confluence, because policies in these large systems are based on what Juan was talking about, of the othering, right? The single story, legalizing the single story, which we know that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has cautioned us about the danger of the single story, right? And that's what all these systems are premised on. We can make these decisions if the person is reduced to one aspect of their life that doesn't take into account their humanity. So to me, there is bleeding into, but each system of government has those policies embedded in them already so much that, when you look at the impact, of course, when a person is incarcerated, then you've got child welfare involved right away. And we have, the titis and the tios and the families of crianza, and we don't have a foster care system that takes that into account. Or that then you've got criminal background checks, right, on the families. And so even if you had something 10 years ago or more, which in New York State should free you up for a number of things. I mean, we can attack that in and of itself, but let's say, that still holds you back from being a foster parent, for taking in the children that you grew up in your, village raising, if you will, right? And so it excludes then other avenues of support for our children. And so, but they're all of these, systems are premised on defining people by their behaviors, right? So let's say, yes, that you committed a crime, okay? Or that you weren't raising your children in whatever way the state said you should be raising your children. You then become that behavior. And we can then, supervise you, violate your rights, take away your rights, et cetera. And so I think that, all these systems strip people that are involved in them, strip people of their humanity. And I would love to see a system that prioritizes humanity, that a just system of, delinquency, criminal, whatever, should be based on a restorative justice approach. One that takes into account community, one that takes into account that the people closest to the problems are closest to the solution, as we all have heard the wonderful, people in the system, Brian Stevenson, and a number of others who encourage us to go in this route, and especially a juvenile justice system, even the foster care system, a system that truly engages families in creating solutions for what's happening at the time. So, I think that, because, la Latinidad is so diverse, right? And like, again, we get reduced, not just as individual people, but as a whole swath of cultures into just one thing, usually, as if we were all the same. And I think that we need to really challenge those perspectives and be able to create better processes, because even before we get to whether there's resources or not, we get into why are people involved in the system in the way they are.
We want to turn to some of the data related to Latinx representation within the criminal legal system here in New York State, within New York City specifically. And so I'm going to turn it over to Lee at the end there to offer some of her data and perspective. Thank you.
So here we're going to look at some of the case processing trends, felony case processing trends for New York State. A couple of things are going to be apparent here. First of all, we're going to look at adult felony arrests. When we do these presentations, we look at it by New York City and outside New York City. As I'm sure you are all well aware, the differences within populations are stark inside New York City and outside. So here we're looking at just the overall population. This is the adult population that Commissioner Rosado spoke about earlier. Looking at the adult population in New York City, we see that by race and ethnicity, it's pretty equally distributed. It's 22% Black in New York City among the adult population, 28% Hispanic, 34% white, with the Asian population being much lower at 16%. But in general, there are some closer proportions across race and ethnicity. Outside New York City, that's very different. It's 75% white in the adult population outside New York City. So when we're looking at the criminal justice system, there are certainly local systems and justice is local, but there are regional systems because the populations are so different. And we'll see this play out throughout the presentation today and in other information. I do want to do a quick plug for the Office of Justice Research and Performance at DCJS and the amazing staff who have built these dashboards that now allow all of you to look at the criminal justice system data in New York State. This is a snapshot of our new arrest dashboard. This is showing in New York City just the volume of felony arrests that are occurring over the last 10 years by race and ethnicity. We'll see up at the top, the highest volume is among Black individuals in New York City, followed by Hispanic individuals with that red line. So 40,000 arrests among Black people in 2014 in New York City, about 25,000 arrests among Hispanic people, and then you drop down to 10,000 arrests among white people in 2014, and even lower among Asian and others. The trends for all of these groups are similar over time. It's been decreasing since 2014. We see a big drop off in 2020 with COVID, and then those felony arrests are increasing again, coming back up to those pre-pandemic levels and even higher. So the trends are the same across race and ethnicity, but the volume is so very different. We see similar trends outside New York City. Again, the felony arrests come down, especially in 2020 with COVID, and then they return again over the following couple of years back to pre-pandemic levels. Outside New York City, we see that the volume is highest among white people, and then that's followed by Black people at 20,000 arrests among Black individuals in 2014. We see arrests among Hispanic individuals outside New York City much lower, around 7,000, 7,500 arrests in 2014, again increasing over time through 2023. So what does this mean in terms of arrest rates? What we see in New York City and outside, even with these differences in population demographics, is that Black and Hispanic people are being arrested at higher rates across the state compared to white and Asian people. In New York City, the arrest rate among Hispanic individuals is almost 4 times what it is among white and Asian individuals. Outside New York City, even though the Hispanic population is a much smaller percentage, the arrest rate is still more than double what it is for white and much more than Asian, with the Black individuals having the highest arrest rates statewide. What we want to look at next is what happens as we move through the system. We're past the point of arrest now with pretrial reform, looking at what happens with these felony arraignments and releases, pretrial releases. Here we're using our awesome supplemental pretrial data file, which is also available on our stats page. And here we can see what happens with felony arraignments in 2019 before the pretrial reforms through 2023. Again, across all races and ethnicities, we see these declines in 2020, the disruptions from COVID, with increases through 2023 back to pre-pandemic times. Following the arrest volume, we see the highest volume of lower court felony arraignments among Black and Hispanic individuals in New York City and among Black and white individuals outside New York City. The gold line through the remainder of these slides will indicate Hispanic individuals, Hispanic populations. This one's dense. Certainly happy to make these available, but this is showing bail setting. We see, of course, in 2020 with the pretrial reforms that bail setting decreased across all categories, across all race and ethnicity. We see bail setting decrease. I do want to point out, and that's looking at the line at the top of each of those sets of bars, still, we do see that bail setting is highest among Black and Hispanic individuals in New York City. So although it has decreased over time, it still remains being ordered. Bail is ordered at higher rates, higher proportions among Black and Hispanic individuals. Outside New York City, when we look at these city and district courts, here we see, number one, a much higher rate of bail setting. So outside New York City, courts are setting bail at much higher percentages. There was a pretty drastic decrease with pretrial reform in 2020, where that bail setting decreased across the board, across all racial and ethnic categories. But here we're seeing it still highest pre-trial, highest in the pre-reform era, and still higher in 2023 among Black and Hispanic individuals. So they're still having bail set at higher rates. When we look at pretrial release outcomes, here again, this one's dense too. The various colors in the bars are showing how people are being released. So the trend was an increase across the board for everybody. Being arraigned in lower court, pretrial releases increased. We see again across the board those increases were greatest where people were being released under supervision or non-monetary release conditions, and that group of people being released under supervision was a huge increase in New York City and also a big increase outside New York City. But these release rates were higher for white and Asian individuals, where just as a matter of being released, the white and Asian defendants were being released pretrial at higher rates in New York City. In outside New York City, we see again this big increase in releases as we saw that bail come down, the bail being set and ordered come down. We see these pretrial releases go up, but trends are similar and small differences still with Black and Hispanic individuals being released at somewhat higher rates here for Hispanic. Finally, we want to take a look at case outcomes. So at the end of the day, what happens with a person's case when their felony arrest is being processed. In New York City, again, these lines are very, very close to each other. So the gold percentages are representing Hispanic defendants, but that's partly because they're so close in New York City. If we look at a felony case moving through the system, we see that overall convictions have decreased over time from 60% in 2019, a marginal decrease to 54% in 2020, and then in 2019, and then in 2020, again with COVID, with the different pretrial reforms that took place, with the different criminal justice reforms taking place, we see those convictions decrease and maintained at a lower rate through 2023. So the conviction rate among felony arrests in 2023 was 32% for Hispanic defendants. Outside New York City, again, just these regional differences, the conviction rate is much higher outside New York City. We see them much closer for Hispanic and for white defendants outside New York City. Still that decrease over time with about a 10 percentage point difference over the 10-year period from 2014 through 2023. We do see that Black defendants are convicted at slightly lower rates. And then with the Asian defendants, there's much more variation there. It is likely due to the very small sample sizes of people. And as more people come into the system, those might stabilize. When we look at conviction and sentences to incarceration, we also see that these sentences to incarceration have come down over time. In New York City, it was about 30% of Hispanic defendants being sentenced to incarceration, meaning prison and jail or jail. That declined slightly to 23% just before COVID, just before these criminal justice reforms, and is still lower at 15% in 2023. Still very similar, very small differences across race and ethnicity in who's being sentenced to incarceration in New York City. Outside New York City, we see a little more variation. We see that Black and Hispanic defendants are slightly more likely to be sentenced to incarceration, but still the percentages being sentenced are coming down over time, but higher than in New York City.